I'm George Galloway.
And I'm Adam Gary.
And we are the History Boys, back after a brief interruption due, unfortunately, to Adam's ill health. He's much stronger now, as you are about to find out. Every week, and it's going to be every week from now on, we'll do an episode of the History Boys, looking at the great events, great theatres of conflict and change, the history of how we got here, because if we don't know how we got here, we're definitely never going to work out how we get out of here. Now, in the last episode, we talked about the First World War and its aftermath, the death of empires, the re-emergence of empires, the emergence of new empires, and foreshadowed today's topic, which is divided peoples. Undoubtedly, both the First World War and the Second World War, though Adam may educate us, for he is a supreme intellectual in this field, on older, longer ago divisions of peoples. But from my point of view, and my historical knowledge is very much the 20th and 21st century, it was these two great cataclysms of the First and Second World War and the revolutions that they begat, which very sizably divided peoples. Adam, welcome back. You're looking in the pink, and I hope that there's no reoccurrence of what happened to you. I hope you're fully fit and able to launch a discourse which I shall respectfully intervene on from time to time, of the main divisions of peoples in the world, what their consequences have been, and to what extent those are remediable, because it could very well be that some people have been divided irredeemably,
yes.
Because the cost to the international order might be too great to remedy their particular ill. So please kick off on divided peoples.
Well, they say that water always finds its level, and I'm actually optimistic in that I think most people who are divided, no matter how long the struggle is, eventually find a way back to unity. And so today I want to discuss peoples that remain divided, peoples that have successfully united, and peoples whose status is rather ignored and therefore in a kind of geopolitical and historical purgatory. And I think, if it's all right with you, we'll begin with Kashmir, which is one of the most tragic cases of a people divided in the 20th century, with its roots after the Second World War and with its roots because of the Second World War. So Jammu and Kashmir today, it used to be what was called a princely state as a matter of law, but a province as a matter of fact. When the British Raj defeated the Sikh Empire in the subcontinent, there was a treaty signed in 1846, the Treaty of Amritsar. And this said that Jammu and Kashmir, whose borders we know today, both in terms of Azad Kashmir, part of Pakistani territory, and the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, known to many of the world's Muslims as Indian-occupied Kashmir, or the IOK. All of this area as a whole was given princely status, which was a kind of, talk about a colonial relic. It was this kind of thing.
It even jars on the ears to hear a princely
really
state.
And so again, a princely state as a matter of law, but it essentially a puppet province of the British Empire in reality. And things were coming to a head long before the partition of India in 1947. In the 20s and 30s, many of the Muslims who make up the vast majority of Kashmir found themselves rightly agitated by the fact that a puppet Hindu prince of the British Empire was their princely master. So already the ethos of self-determination was wired into the marrow of the indigenous peoples there long before 1947. But it was, of course, in 1947 when things came to a head for the following reason. Kashmir is divided between several main areas. There's the Vale of Kashmir or Kashmir Valley. There's what is now known as Azad Kashmir or Free Kashmir. There's Gilgit-Baltistan. There's Ladakh, and there's Jammu. These are all the populated areas of Kashmir. Now, with the exception of Ladakh, which is mainly Buddhist, and Jammu, which has a slight majority of Hindus, the rest is vast majority Muslim, and of course, as a whole, it's quite vastly Muslim in terms of the majoritarian confessional background of the population. Enter a Pontius Pilate-like character called Hari Singh, Prince, or Maharaja, all these colonial titles that, again, they do induce...
Mustn't undersell him. He was a Maharaja.
Yes, indeed. No, it does induce the kind of ill health which might get the show cancelled for another week. So we mustn't we mustn't use too much colonial rhetoric. But that was his title, and his Pontius Pilate moment was as follows. He realized that the majority of his population was Muslim, and that ascension to the newly formed state of India, which, although multi-confessional, was clearly Hindu-dominated, and that's causing controversy to this day with the Hindutva extremist government of Narendra Modi. More on that some other day. But he knew that wasn't going to work out, but because of the minority groups, including Hindus and including Buddhists, he also was ambivalent about joining the new Islamic Republic of Pakistan. The Muslims, though, acting as nationalists in the best sense of the word and wanting their self-determination, they started rebelling. They said, it's not up to a Maharaja to tell us where to go. It's not up to the remnants of the British Empire, of Governor General Lord Mountbatten, to tell us where to go. It's up to us to tell us where to go. And while the modern nationalistic rhetoric coming out of India says, oh, it was Pakistan who created an agitation by sending men there, how ridiculous is that, to say that a state that is only 3 months old, fighting for the very essence of its existence, could commit an act of aggression against a disputed purgatory-like province, who's on the other side of which is a state that's equally young and equally trying to find its identity after decades and indeed centuries of various European occupations, because it wasn't just the British, it was the Portuguese, it was the French, it was others in the Indian subcontinent. So at that point, this Maharaja said, I need help. I need Indian troops to stop this Pakistani aggression. And Britain, being the empire that it was still sort of at the time, Lord Mountbatten, the last Governor General or Viceroy of India, said, well, you can have Indian protection, which is under the training of the British Army, but only if you sign an accession agreement whereby you join India. That was his Pontius Pilate moment. That's what sealed the fate of Jammu and Kashmir, and it's what led to the 1948 war between India and Pakistan, the first of many future wars between the now nuclear-armed neighboring rivals. This is what created the essential line of control that we have today, the dividing line between Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Kashmir, which is controlled from Islamabad, and Jammu, Ladakh, and the Kashmir Valley, which is very controversially ruled or occupied by New Delhi. And later, some of the unoccupied areas were taken by China in the north, and this was after the 62 war that India fought with China.
Before we get to 62, now, Mr. Nehru, the president, first prime minister and father of Indira Gandhi, a long-time prime minister also of India, he accepted the United Nations resolution to have a plebiscite to ultimately determine the fate of Jammu and Kashmir. That's a promise that he, a great figure in the non-aligned movement, made before the world, but it's never been redeemed. That promise has never been kept. Say something about that.
Well, indeed, this is the major point of contention that exists between Islamabad and New Delhi to this day. According to UN Resolution 47, one of the first most important resolutions that the young UN dealt with, there needed to be a plebiscite throughout all of Jammu and Kashmir, where on a one-man, one-woman, one-vote basis, people would decide whether they wanted to be part of India, Pakistan, or some independent state, though in reality I've never thought the idea of an independent state of Kashmir was very viable. The reason that this has never actually happened is because the two sides cannot agree on the wording of the resolution. While the resolution calls for a unilateral withdrawal of the troops, Pakistan has rightly worried that if its troops were to withdraw first, what would stop India from just coming into the areas that are under Pakistani protection and have been since the war in 1948? Enter an Australian man called Owen Dixon, who around this time proposed something which on paper sounds quite interesting, which is why not break up Jammu and Kashmir and say Ladakh and Jammu go with India and the remaining populated parts, primarily the valley of Kashmir, go to Pakistan along with the now Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. That was rejected on all sides, and now the issue has stretched to the point where breaking up Jammu and Kashmir into its constituent parts would generally be seen as totally unacceptable from all perspectives. So while the best and most fair resolution to this ongoing conflict, which by the way has dated back to the exact same time as the more publicized Israel-Palestine conflict, indeed, it's the best solution, but there's just inertia in terms of the international community getting involved, because India and Pakistan are both growing economies, they're both very influential countries, they're both nuclear armed. No one in the international community, including China and Russia, really want to take a side, even though China clearly has its loyalties to Pakistan, Russia a far more complicated issue now than in the days of Nehru and Indira Gandhi.
Now, the cost of this division has now become enormous. Just as the Palestinian Intifada began in 1987, 88, so an uprising in Jammu and Kashmir, particularly in the valley, more or less shadows that. Except in the case of the uprising in Jammu and Kashmir, the human cost has been even greater than the cost of the Intifada. More than 100,000 easily have been killed. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced, imprisoned, disappeared. There's allegations of torture, of the use of rape as a weapon of war. One could argue about the validity of these allegations, but the cost is testified to by the fact that the Indian Army of Occupation now is the biggest army of occupation in the entire world. It's 600,000. So 1.2 million Indian boots, 2 boots per person, on the ground in this tiny place, which topographically is paradise, heaven on earth, transformed into hell on earth by an occupation so vast that it guarantees enduring enmity, uprising, resistance, and so on.
Indeed, well, a lot of the Indian nationalist propagandists say, oh, it's just a small group of foreign terrorists who are running amok. You wouldn't need those 2 million boots on the ground to subdue a happy population. Happy populations don't need to be militarily occupied. Perhaps spied on with CCTV cameras and hacked into by the NSA, but not 2 million boots on the ground. It's as if to say that the people of Gaza are somehow happy living in the cage. Well, if they were happy, there wouldn't need to be a cage. So the exact same principle applies to Jammu and Kashmir, only as you say, in terms of the actual human costs, it's much more. Making matters even worse now is the water wars element, because some of the most important rivers that feed both Pakistan and India run through Indian-occupied Kashmir. And so you have an environmental crisis that is now brewing beneath the long-standing human and geopolitical crisis. And in terms of solutions, you were talking about crises of human divisions that can be solved and that can't be. It will take, I think, something outside of a state-based format, so outside of the United Nations, for this to be solved. The BDS movement, for example, boycott, divestment, sanctions, has turned the issue of Palestine from one that's now cool to talk about, and while that might seem very vulgar that it's now a rock star issue, it did take the autistic and athletic community in the 1980s to get people who otherwise wouldn't care, to care about apartheid South Africa. We're seeing a gradual shift with the BDS movement in Israel, with now rock stars that might have never met an Arab person in their life, not know anything about the history of the Balfour Declaration and of the Nakba, now talking about Palestine. I believe it will take a non-state peaceful movement to get the world talking about Kashmir and the plight of the Kashmiris in the same way. That to me seems to be the only reasonable solution, albeit not an ideal one, because it implies the long term rather than the kind of immediate reprieve that the people so desperately need.
He is the history boy. Now, Adam, there are plenty more peoples to choose from that have been divided. Let's first define, though, what we mean by a people. I cling to the definition in the constitution of the former Soviet Union, that a people, a nation, are an historically constituted group of people with a common language, with a common culture, with common economic interests, and a common perception of themselves to be a people, to be a nation. I don't know if you accept that definition.
Oh, I accept that totally. I think one of the brilliant aspects of the Soviet definition of a people, and indeed of modern Russian nationality law, is that when there's a dispute, the person or group of people can themselves decide how they identify. So in an age where we talk about people choosing their own identity in terms of gender or even race, that's a new one for some, but it's been in the papers. Certainly one's nationality, one's culture must be defined by what one feels, because a culture is nothing if it isn't acted upon. If not, well, it's just history. But this is, of course, living history. And against this framework, by the way, I would add, this wouldn't be in the Soviet constitution, but religious identity is, in some cases, obviously crucial too, Kashmir being one of them. But in others, for example, Korea, Vietnam, and others that we'll discuss, the Soviet definition really fits perfectly.
Let's talk about Korea first then, because it's higher in the news. I never met a people who are more obviously one people than the Koreans. And I think that is being demonstrated with the kind of love-in that now exists between North and South Korea. If ever a people were more artificially divided, the Korean people were that people. The language, the culture, the common perception of themselves as a people, all torn asunder by geopolitical conflict, force, which really had nothing to do with them. What do you say?
Absolutely right. Literally, a line was drawn in the sand on the 38th parallel, dividing a part of the Korean peninsula, which after the brutal Japanese occupation was fought off and gotten rid of, mainly by those on the left, it must be said. The spoils of the Korean peninsula weren't given instantaneously back to the united common Korean people, but they said, right, the Soviets are going to have a zone of occupation in the northern part and the Americans in the southern part. What could possibly go wrong, we can say with hindsight? Well, a lot went wrong, and it went wrong pretty quickly. The Soviet Union said we need national elections, meaning a united Korean election run by the Koreans themselves, Korean committees, Korean political parties. So quite progressive for an occupying force, which is what it was, albeit under the guise of law, as it was at the time, to say that. The United States, a people so free that freedom has become very expensive for those who have to experience it outside of the US borders, they said, no, we want an international committee to run these elections. By and by, between 1945, when this all started, and 1948, you have two distinctive governments arise in the North and in the South. In the South, a man called Syngman Rhee, who I can only describe as the kind of Northeast Asian Pinochet on steroids, is essentially the man who rises to power in the American sphere. Anyone to the left of him was essentially an enemy of the people, and mass violence was meted out by Rhee onto various leftist groups. And these were genuine leftist groups, nothing particularly to do with the Soviet Union. These were groups that had fought the Japanese, gotten rid of the Imperial Japanese, and now wanted to live in a progressive, modern, independent country. Rhee would have none of that. Then the fate was sealed when Rhee refused to have nationwide elections and instead, with US supervision, held elections only in the South that even America's European and Australian allies thought were heavily rigged. So to criticize the US at that time for having unfair elections, and these were the allies, mind you, it just goes to show you how unfair these elections that put the far-right Rhee regime in power were. The violence only got worse after 1948, which incidentally was the same year that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was declared in the north by Kim Il-sung, a war hero against Japanese imperialism. Then things really tended to break. The straw that broke the camel's back occurred when the violence in the South got so bad that the partisans, the leftist groups throughout various regions of the South, called on Pyongyang to liberate us. So when the North Korean troops crossed the divided peninsula in 1950, it wasn't the kind of war of aggression that the US and its allies said. It was really a war of internal political struggle that the rest of the world should have stayed away from. Instead, the United States reduced Pyongyang to absolute rubble, killed millions of Koreans, and as a result, you
about 20% of the Korean population. Imagine
very
1 in
much
5
yes.
of all Koreans
More
was
bombs
killed by the United States.
More bombs were dropped by the United States on Korea in a 3-year period than all of the bombs dropped in the Second World War combined.
Incredible.
And Douglas MacArthur wanted to nuke Korea and China, because when the People's Liberation Army of China, in a debt of gratitude to the Koreans who helped the Chinese partisans during the Chinese Civil War, when they came in, Douglas MacArthur actually wanted to drop multiple nuclear weapons on Korea and on China, which could well have brought, if not brought the world as we know it to an end, it certainly would have made life for subsequent generations.
Where does China fit in here? China is, of course, the neighbor of Korea, but the North Korean political power owed everything to the Soviet Union. It was its closest ally. How did that come about? Is this part of the Sino-Soviet split? And why did Kim Il-sung cleave to the USSR rather than China?
The short answer is that there was less of a history between the Korean people and the Russian people, because while the Sino-Korean border is quite a dynamic border, the Russo-Korean border is quite desolate. And so because of that, there wasn't any baggage attached to a Soviet partnership. So while the Soviet Union, for geopolitical reasons, wanted greater influence in Northeast Asia, there was a feeling that even though the government of Mao and the government government of Kim were both communist governments. They approached communism in a different way. The Juche ideology of Kim Il-sung is quite different in terms of doctrine than Maoism was. And practically, it was a matter of gaining leverage. And so, while the DPRK managed to survive the Sino-Soviet split of 1961 and have genuinely normal relations with the rivaling communist superpowers of China and the USSR, until the 90s, it was always the Soviet Union which was the closer of the two superpowers to North Korea. And indeed, the political system of North Korea, right down to the pageantry, it tends to be more Russian than Chinese. Even the beautiful DPRK patriotic music, it owes much more to Alexander Alexandrov, the founder of the Red Army Choir, than it does to Maoist patriotic music.
China was, however, of course, drawn into the war and lost a phenomenal number of men.
Indeed, China felt, well, the popular narrative was that because a lot of the communist North Korean partisans helped the Maoist side in the Chinese Civil War against the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, there was a feeling of sort of reciprocity, let's help our comrades. In reality, though, China, Red China, as the right-wingers called it, didn't want the United States to have a puppet country right on its borders. So in terms of geostrategy, the reason that we see the film of the Chinese soldiers by the thousands storming across the border to help the DPRK, and they eventually pushed the pro-US side well south of the 38th parallel, the reason because of that is that Mao didn't want a US puppet regime on his doorstep.
Now, of all the divided peoples, would it be your view that the Koreans are more likely in our lifetime, say, to be reunited than any others?
What a difference a year makes. If you'd asked me that question a year ago, I would have given a diplomatic answer, a politician's answer. Now, though, I can say with confidence, with optimism, and of course with sincerity, that I believe in the lifetime of us and our viewers that the Korean people will in some shape or form be united. In the short term, it will be a one country, two systems model, akin to post-colonial Hong Kong's relationship with the rest of China. But in the long term, I do believe that this peninsula, which isn't humongous so far as land masses in Asia go, I do believe it will become a single state with a single government, single economic system, etc.
So you show me Korea, I'll show you Ireland. Which of these two peoples will be reunited first? Say something about the division in Ireland.
Well, the division in Ireland goes back in many ways to the 16th century and Henry VIII's subduing of Ireland. But to bring it back to the contemporary era, this has to do with multiple so-called Home Rule bills that the British Liberal Party, which meant quite a bit something different in the era of Gladstone and Lloyd George than it means in the era of whoever the hell's in charge of it now.
I think it's Vince Cable.
Right. Sorry, Vince. No hard feelings. But so anyway, multiple Home Rule bills were introduced, and this ended up splitting the Liberal Party between the liberal imperialists, and I am talking about the 19th century.
Yes.
The liberal imperialists and the pro-Home Rule liberals. Eventually, in 1914, a Home Rule bill was passed through the Parliament, but then the First World War started, which we saw in our previous episode. That delayed it. This led to it delayed its implementation. This led to the Easter Rising of 1916, which is considered a great moment of national self-awakening in Irish history. And at the same time,
a military disaster for the Irish, but a political triumph.
Indeed, and an emotional triumph.
A bit like the Tet Offensive in Vietnam.
Very much so, very much so. And at the same time, you see Ulster Unionists rising, because under King James I, in order to subdue the Irish Catholic population, lowland Scots, who were ultra-Protestant Cromwellians, were told to go to the north of Ireland and plant
As
your
settlers.
roots. Yes, indeed. And so you have a population of Protestants in Northern Ireland who were led by Mr. Corson in the early 20th century, who essentially said, come hell or high water will Ireland gain its independence. So much like a kind of Owen Dixon plan for Kashmir, in 1922 the solution was to create a Southern Ireland or Irish Free State, and then the north of Ireland became the British province of Northern Ireland. We're still there to this day. Obviously, in the late 40s, Ireland became a republic.
Indeed, it's 50 years this day since the latest uprising of the Irish people, a peaceful uprising from the side of the Irish, demanding normal civil rights, one man, one woman, one vote, in the 6 counties of the northeast of Ireland, to give them their proper depiction, crushed mercilessly by the Protestant authorities, the Unionist authorities, which in turn began a new era of armed conflict between Britain and Irish republicanism, bloody and scarring for everyone concerned. But the demography is marching on, isn't it? There's now almost a majority of Roman Catholics in the hitherto assumed to be permanently Protestant and Unionist Northern Ireland province.
Absolutely right. There's 2 things which are absolutely shifting this dynamic. One, it's the demographic change, and 2, it's Brexit. So while that might be in the newspapers rather than the history books, we're actually living through a very historic moment, because the European Union is not going to accept an open border between a state with no kind of Norway-style or Switzerland-style agreement with it and an EU member state called the Republic of Ireland. When that happens, this fragile piece where Northern Ireland's part of Britain but with Irish characteristics, this fragile settlement that's existed for around 20 years now, could be thrown into absolute turmoil. And we'll soon find out in March of next year, when Britain is supposed to leave the EU, we'll find out if this ironclad border dividing an Irish island that is now more united than it had been in much of the 20th century, we'll see if this will lead to more troubles, which could eventually, I think perhaps sooner rather than later, leading to a united Irish Republic.
I'll bet my house on it. We've been the History Boys. Tune in next week and every week for more fascinating discourse on the great historical events and ideas that have shaped the world we have today. I've been George Galloway.
I've been Adam Garrett.
Bye for now.